Good evening, everyone. Thank you all for joining us in this virtual space tonight. I hope that you're all comfy and cozy on this gloriously chilly evening with all manner of creature comfort at your side. I have a few announcements before we officially start tonight's program. The Meadows still remains closed to the general public, but we do have all of the exhibitions in virtual 3D tours. So those of you both near and far who are not able to visit in person right now can have some interaction with the current exhibitions. I hope that those of you that have known about this have had a chance to explore and enjoyed your time in the space. And just another quick announcement about the exhibitions, we're going to have changing out one of them here, and we'll have a new one up just for the remainder of the semester. It's the South Central Chapter of the Society for Photographic Education's juried exhibition. So I hope to get that up within the next week. So look for those 3D tour online. We have one more virtual event coming up on Thursday, November 12th. Odette England will finally be joining us to talk about her book, Keeper of the Hearth. As some of you who are joining us might remember, she was originally scheduled to visit us last spring, but the pandemic arrived on our shores at the same time. And things shut down, so her visit was postponed. I've had the pleasure of listening to Odette speak on a number of occasions now about this project, and it's been a different experience and wonderful each and every time, so I promise you that will be a lovely evening as well. We're excited to have her join us on November 12th, which is incidentally Roland Barthes' birthday, and his book, The Camera Lucida, was the inspiration for her project. The date and registration link for that can be found on the Meadows website under events. And as always, we'll certainly be making more announcements on social media with details as that event approaches. And lastly, just a few Zoom webinar tips. Feel free to use the chat function you can see at the bottom of your screen and say hi to people if you're so inclined. However, if you have a question for the members of the panel, please use the Q&A window to type them in, and I'll read them aloud at the end of the discussion during our Q&A time. We do suggest that you view this talk in gallery view so you can see all the panelists at the same time, so windows aren't flickering back and forth between individual panelists once the discussion gets going. But of course, that choice is yours. And if you don't know where to change that setting, it's in the upper right-hand corner of your screen. For any centenary students joining us tonight, I'll share the QR code for passport points at the end of the discussion. And if any of you have any difficulty with the scan, please email me later with a picture of the code, and I'll be sure to get your points credited to your account. And now it is my pleasure to welcome back Michelle Burdine, the organizer and moderator for tonight's discussion. She holds a Master of Fine Arts in Studio Art and Photography from The Ohio State University and a Master of Humanities from Wright State University in Dayton, Ohio. She's currently the visiting assistant professor of photography at Murray State University in Kentucky. Her work has been exhibited in solo and group exhibitions for over 20 years, and she's an interdisciplinary artist who relies on photographic vocabulary and processes to create her multimedia works. Her extended study of humanities and photography has built the foundation for her visual exploration of socially constructed systems. Her work explores time, loss, and her own menstruating body. And her current exhibition here at the Meadows right now, and Time Past, is as much about loss as it is about what it is to be a woman. And with that, I will turn the evening over to Michelle to introduce our esteemed panelists and get the discussion started. So welcome back, Michelle, and thank you everybody on the panel for agreeing to participate tonight. I've really been looking forward to this, and I hope everyone else enjoys it as much as I anticipate enjoying it.
Thank you so much, Heather. And yes, thanks to the Meadows Museum and to our distinguished panel and all of the audience for spending your evening in conversation with us. It has certainly been my pleasure to work with the faculty from Centenary. I've learned so much from this group of scholars during our collaboration and our collaboration discussions and emails. So yeah, let me introduce the panel. Dr. Andia Augustin-Billy is an assistant professor of French and Francophile studies at Centenary College of Louisiana. Her interests include, her interest areas focus on gender and sexuality in Francophone, Caribbean, and African literatures and culture. Her recent article, Tu es ridicule, When Black Women Speak Up and Speak Out, in Ferdinand Oyono's novels, was published in the 2020 MilFlick Review. Dr. Amanda Mandy Donahoe is an assistant professor of political science here at Centenary. She teaches comparative politics and international relations broadly. Her research focuses on the intersections of identity, particularly gender and peace and conflict studies. She's the author of Peace Building Through Women's Community Development, We Women's Work in Northern Ireland, published in 2017, New York, from the Palgrave Macmillan. Dr. Jay McGrove is an assistant professor of US history at Centenary. Her courses cover the Americas with an emphasis on race, class, and gender. Prior to arriving here at Centenary, she was involved in instructor training, presentations, and curriculum development designed to offer resources to college level instructors that allow them to quickly integrate gender and LGBTQ+ topics into their existing US history courses. And finally, Dr. Michelle Wokemir is the Tracy Whitehurst Woods Board of Regents Endowed Professor of Sociology and Gender Studies at Centenary College. Her book, Be Not Deceived, The Sacred and Sexual Struggles of Gay and Ex-Gay Christian Men, received the 2006 American Sociological Association's Book Award in Sexualities. Other publications focus on mixed orientation marriage, non-monogamy, gender power dynamics among various groups, and interviewing techniques for sensitive populations. She also was appointed to Shreveport's Mayoral Human Relations Commission to work against discriminatory practices. Thank you again all for agreeing to be on this panel. As Heather mentioned, my work is currently on exhibit here in the Meadows, and that much of it considers the intersection of human bodies and the institutions that, while created by humans, also serve to control them, such as the medical institution and historically traditional Western family structures. When Heather and I were talking about this event, or what events we could do that could align with my work, as well as COVID era limitations, we started thinking about the present moment and what it means to identify as female in 2020, 100 years after women's suffrage, in an election year just around the corner, with our newly confirmed Supreme Court nominee who has previously taken positions against abortion rights, who seems open to reversing the rights of the LGBTQ community, and admitted under questioning by Senator Cory Booker that she was not familiar with any preceding or precedent-setting court cases having to do with race and racial justice. As we celebrate the 100 years of women's suffrage in the US, days away from this election, where both candidates have been accused of sexual misconduct or assault, where we've recently had the whistleblower about forced sterilization in the ICE detention centers, along with forced separation of parents and children. It was from this place that this panel was formed. And so when the panel met remotely, of course, we thought about our current moment in history, as well as our journey through history, a journey that extends, of course, beyond the US borders, and alongside the research that each of us has done in our respective fields. And from this conversation, a common theme emerged. So tonight, we'll begin with our focus in ways in which the women's bodies are entangled in larger structures of society. And so to begin our conversation, each of our panelists is now going to address some ways in which this larger topic is addressed within their respective fields of research. So I'm going to turn it over now to Mandy to begin.
All right, sort of get my game face on. Thank you so much, Michelle, and really very happy to be here. I want to start talking about continuum, and I'll explain what I mean further, but really specifically the continuums of gender, peace, and war. But in order to understand why continua are important or valuable, we're going to start talking about dichotomies. And we'll start with gender. So when we talk about gender, we're talking about a social construct, not a thing that exists biologically or physiologically, not a thing that we can touch, but a thing that we act and react to. So gender is a social construct based on biological sex, yes, either real or perceived, but it is most often represented by the masculine-feminine dichotomy. So there's our first dichotomy. However, as we know, gender is more than this. Gender structures many aspects of our society to such a degree that we think of things as masculine and feminine that have no relation to the male or female bodies. For example, how many of you have gendered your car, right? Dichotomous, mutually exclusive categories, right? So you're either male or masculine or female or feminine, not both. That's how dichotomies work. These dichotomous, mutually exclusive categories such as male-female, but also subject-object, war, peace, strong, weak, active, and passive, are gendered in a way that privileges the first term, assigning lesser value to the second, where war and strength and action become masculine, peace, weakness, passivity are seen as feminine. These dichotomies are both dismissive of other experiences, like those we try to cover with the LGBTQA+ umbrella. They're also inaccurately based on a particular masculinity, not all, right? A particular masculinity and a particular femininity. At the top of the social hierarchy is a hegemonic masculine ideal that supports other masculinities. Consider here the trope of the effeminate gay man in America. But required to support this hierarchy is a hegemonic femininity, that which is associated with peace or weakness, which also subordinates other femininities. Consider the trope of the angry Black woman, who is neither feminine nor peaceful, and also cannot be masculine. This dichotomy is also emasculating to male peacemakers and pacifists, who are accused of being weak or cowardly. Second, it neglects the dividends of war, right? The potential for conflict and post-conflict words are so hard, y'all. The potential for conflict and for post-conflict contexts or environments to be favorable to women. Women do actually benefit in certain ways from war. Third, it limits our understanding and expectations of women's contributions to peace. I will also add, fourth, that this dichotomy ignores the reality that gender is not dichotomous, and it reinforces the norms and privileges of people who are cisgender, whose gender identity corresponds with their sex at birth. There's an assumption that anyone who does not identify in this way is deviant. Such cisnormativity is a kind of violence. So instead of this dichotomy, male and female, gender is more constructively viewed as a continuum or a set of continua that include gender identity, gender expression, sexual orientation, and biological sex. So that as a single individual, as a single real human in the world today, I can be both feminine in some ways and masculine in some ways. I can be hetero or homo or bi. I can be all of these things in different kinds of ways, in different complex ways that make me real and round and not dichotomous. Okay, so that was 3 of my 5 minutes. So I want to add 2 more continua to the conversation. Let's break apart the dichotomy of peace and violence. Peace is more than the end of war, right? That's how, if they're a dichotomy, then when war starts, peace is over, and when war ends, peace can begin. This is not the reality. Betty Reardon, one of my favorite scholars, argues that peace is a social environment that favors the full development of the human person. So if peace favors the full development of the human person, then violence is an interruption or an intervention in this development. Violence comes in many forms and occurs in many spaces, so that we can easily imagine formal peace being negotiated in the White House, while domestic violence continues in the family house. But thinking about violence as a continuum helps us see the links between these various categories, typologies of violence. We can also then see violence in the structures around us, so that violence can be found in colonialism, racism, poverty, and patriarchy. It has been argued then that these are structures of violence. And violence, just as peace may be, is gendered. I have super lots of more good stuff to say about all that, but I will wrap it up and thank you for listening and hand the mic, so to speak, over to Michelle.
Hi, everybody. I am going to pick up on one of the structures of violence that Mandy discussed, and literally talk about violence against women. More specifically, what I want to do with my time tonight is to explore how our cultural discourse and media representations of violence against women actually recreate a kind of victimization in two primary ways. Oh, and there are more ways. We're just going with two right now. First, the representations that we use of violence against women tend to render men invisible and silent and veil their culpability in that violence. And second, because men appear absent in these representations, women's bodies not only remain vulnerable to physical and sexual violence, but their very beings are held to account, to explanation for the violence that occurs against them. So in this sense, they're doubly victimized in some ways. Now, to begin this exploration, I want to start, because I'm a sociologist and we always have to start with statistics, with a few key statistics. And the first are from the FBI's Uniform Crime Reports that come from 2019. In those crime reports, we find out that men committed almost 80% of all violent crimes in 2019, and they committed approximately 90% of all rapes, murders, and sexual assaults of women. According to the CDC's National Intimate Partner and Sexual Violence Survey, about 1 in 5 women and about 1 in 7 men will experience physical violence. And by the way, physical violence is any kind of violence. Whereas about 1 in 5 women and 1 in 12 men will experience sexual violence. About 21% of all women will experience rape or attempted rape in their lifetimes, whereas only 2.6% of all men will. To reiterate, men commit the vast majority of violence in the United States. Yet, despite the fact that we have all this empirical evidence, and these are just little pieces of empirical evidence, we could do a lot more. Despite this empirical evidence that men do most of the violence in our culture, news reports and our cultural discourse surrounding this violence tends to move men sort of to the periphery of the story, if not at times removing them from it altogether. Jackson Katz, in his documentary Tough Guys, notes that most of the violence men perpetuate against women is reported in the following ways, and I'll just give you a few examples. Woman murdered after concert, brutal rape of woman in park, teen sexually assaulted, or brutal beating leaves wife in a coma. In my own experience, I was once awarded a grant to reduce violence against women on campus from the Justice Department. In each of these instances, what I hope that you'll notice is that the writers here are using a passive voice to describe this violence, so that the only bodies that are actually present in the story, in the headline, are women's bodies. And in this way, women are placed at the center of our cultural voice and our cultural vision of violence. The men who commit it simply disappear. Women are violated or at risk of violation, while men are not seen as violators or at risk of violating. This construction thus not only obscures men's role in violence, but it tends to make violence a women's issue, rather than calling into question the larger societal dynamics that undergird these patterns of violence. Worse yet, sometimes, the discourse surrounding violence calls women's voices, their claims, into question, as we saw recently in the backlash to the Me Too movement and the debacle of the Kavanaugh Supreme Court nomination, when Christine Blasey Ford's testimony against him for sexual assault powerfully described how he violated her. And yet he was confirmed as a Supreme Court justice. And the cultural discourse in the newspapers surrounding this event was filled with these kinds of phrases, quote, "Boys will be boys. It's out of his system now. It was when he was young. Was she drinking? Did she lead him on?" However we dismissed it, he now sits in the highest court in the land, deciding just what is just. The way we discuss this violence in this passive voice with men missing from view, or the ever-present question of what she did or did not do to stop the assault or the violence, implies that women, I'm sorry, you're right, Mandy, words are hard, implies that women somehow are culpable for becoming victims. As Jonathan Lindsell writes in an article called Rape in the Papers, the use of passive voice here encourages people, readers, to seek an actor, a cause, and they're only left with women. So they ask questions like, and I quote him here because he does this so much better than I would, quote, "Did she kiss him? Did she ever kiss anyone? Is she married? Is she an atheist? Was she sexually active? Had she taken all the necessary precautions not to be raped, including, but not limited to, telling a friend she was leaving, asking for a male chaperone, carrying a whistle, carrying pepper spray, practicing taekwondo, and my personal favorite, wearing an electrified girdle," end quote. Gotta love Lindsell. His dark sense of humor pushes us in a perhaps funny way to a critical point that the representation of violence in our culture encourages us to think about this violence in terms of what women can do or have done. Seeing them as victims who can be called upon to have to explain their victimization or taken to task for their irresponsibility in avoiding this kind of violence. Nowhere here in what I've expressed to you do we see any of those statistics where men commit most of the violence. Men aren't shown as the source of violence. We don't use our media and cultural discourse to shine light and attention on why men do violence in American culture, or to critically examine the gendered power dynamics that permeate our culture in ways that create systematic patterns of violence or dominance. There's no corresponding call for men to explain, for men to change. On this, their very necessary voice remains passively sidelined. As a result, and Andy, in conclusion, this violence and the threat of violence leave women doubly at risk, both for her bodily integrity and for the clarity and power of her voice, as she's limited in her ability to raise it seriously and to be taken seriously against the men who lurk only in the shadows of the cultural vision of this issue.
Thank you, Michelle. You are awesome. I love you. I learned so much from you. Anyways, thank you for having me, Michelle. Thank you so much for organizing this, and Heather. To my fellow panelists, what an honor to participate in this critical discussion around gender equality and the promotion of women's rights. While we emphasize that women's rights are human rights, I would be remiss if from the onset I do not call attention to the fact that Black bodies often stand at the periphery and are more than ever under state-sanctioned violence, propelling 3 Black women to use the hashtag Black Lives Matter, launching a national and international phenomenon. In these United States, Black women disproportionately endure injustice. They die from pregnancy-related causes at 3 to 4 times the rate of white women. Black women earn 64 cents per dollar to a white man compared to 78 cents that white women earn, and are incarcerated nearly 3 times the rate of white women. And these are just statistics. This is where we stand. And I mean statistics, I mean some statistics. My remarks tonight will focus on the ways in which violence has mapped itself on the body of the Black woman in a post-colonial context. And by post-colonial context, I'm looking at colonialism, slavery, dictatorship, and other conflicts in Africa, in the Americas. To all, I invite you to embark on a journey with me. Let's revisit history together. I was born in Haiti, in the Caribbean. My history is drenched in violence and expressive resistance. As an elementary school girl, I learned that in 1492, a 25-year-old white man named Christopher Columbus, with a posse of other white men, came from far away and discovered my land. I also learned that such land was already inhabited by the Taínos, a group of people whose political, social, and religious organization rivaled any civilization. As the pages of history unfold in front of me, they reveal gory acts of violence, such as pillage, rape, and murder that these Spanish conquistadores committed. Of their countless of victims, one in particular stands out. It is that of the Taino queen, Ana Caona, a poet, dancer, and a painter. She reigned over a fertile and vast territory. Well, the European men were not comfortable with that. They had to conquer her, dominate her, kill her, but not before raping her. And after they raped her, they hung her sexually violated body at the public square. As the critic Régine Jean-Charles observes, the circulation of these stories in Haitian cultural memory established that rape plays a role alongside other forms of violence in the creation of nation and national identity, and that women's bodies are understood to be territories of colonial conquest. Indeed, from pre-colonial era to present, structures of domination and oppression have ensnared, entangled bodies of women into a vortex of violence, leaving in their wake lasting trauma. Remember the transatlantic trade from which major European countries and the United States profited? Recently, in a conversation about his support for Donald Trump, the rapper Kanye West brilliantly mused, when you hear about slavery for 400 years, that sounds like a choice, end of quote. For the record, the slave trade, which occurred between 15th and 19th century, trafficked approximately 15 million bodies of Black men, women, and children from Africa to the Americas for the purposes of forced labor. It was not a choice. And allow me to take a brief commercial. Today, various forms of modern day slavery exist, including forced sex labor and forced marriage. And I believe I'm treading into Michelle's territory here. But to quickly put things into perspective, in 2016, 88% of the victims of forced marriage were women and girls, with 37% of them forced to marry before the age of 18. Women and girls account for 99% of victims in the commercial sex industry. But I digress. We are on a journey, so let's keep going. During the passage, while Black men lay on the hull of the ship like fetid merchandise, the woman, the Black woman, on the other hand, does not lose her status as a woman. Forcibly captured, humiliated, terrified, here she is, her body, an unwelcomed means through which merchants and crew forcibly fulfill their sexual desire. This sexually abused body, in the eyes of the European man, invites a unique comportment. As a Black woman and African and perceived as hypersexual, she differs from the pure, delicate, and asexual white womanhood, and as such, denied protection and respect. Therefore, on her body, the white man articulates his wildest fantasies, violently punishing her at the same time for causing him to stray from the norm. Forever sullied, never to be a virgin, she is an object, the property of her master. Later on the plantation, her body becomes a machine of production and reproduction. Cheaper than men, she often outnumbers the man in agricultural fieldwork or performs the same backbreaking task. Her violated body has no respite. Her owners weaponize her pregnancies with multiple births, guaranteeing their income and wealth. While her body suffers perpetual violence from the white man, the Black man uses it in a futile attempt to restore his trampled dignity and virility. Sexual pleasure is elusive. It is rather domination and possession through sex. Conflict and political instability often exacerbate sexual violence. Indeed, in post-colonial contexts, whether under the reign of strongmen in Haiti, here I'm thinking about Duvalier, Aristide, or during the genocide in Rwanda, or even now in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, dubbed the rape capital of the world, where mass rapes of women have occurred for more than a decade, men in power have systematically used rape as a punishment for political dissidents, or simply as a recreational activity. The sexual abuse of the Black girl and woman aboard ships, plantations, and elsewhere raises the question of consent and silence. The feminist critic Gayatri Spivak, in her seminal text, Can the Subaltern Speak? Words are hard, hashtag, observes that in the context of colonial production in male dominance, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak. The subaltern as a female is even more deeply in shadow. That may be so. However, I am fascinated by the creative ways the Black woman has given voice to her silence, the manner in which her eloquent rage has resounded, and the way her resistance has confounded assumptions. She will defy the religious leader or her parents and not marry her rapist. And I have seen that in parentheses in Haitian culture and with my father as a church. Girls are often encouraged to marry their rapists in order to restore order. She will find agency and capitalize off on her own body. She will negotiate pleasure on her own terms. The subaltern can and does speak, but it may not be the way that we understand it. I began my journey with one woman, and I would like to leave you with the words of two more. On May 29, 1851, the abolitionist and former enslaved Sojourner Truth addressed a women's rights convention in Akron, Ohio. And these are her words, I quote, "That men there says that women need to be helped into carriages and lifted over ditches and to have the best place everywhere. Nobody ever helps me into carriages or over mud puddles or gives me any best place. And I, a woman, look at me, look at my arm. I have plowed and planted and gathered into barns, and no man could head me. And I, a woman, I could work as much and eat as much as a man when I could get it, and bear the lash as well. And I, a woman, I have borne 13 children and seen most all sold off to slavery. And when I cried out with my mother's grief, none but Jesus heard me. And then I, a woman, then that little man in black there, he says women can't have as much rights as men's because Christ wasn't a woman. Where did your Christ come from? Where did your Christ come from? From God and a woman. If the first woman God ever made was strong enough to turn the world upside down all alone, these women together ought to be able to turn it back and get it right side up again. In her op-ed published in the New York Times last month, the rapper, singer, and songwriter Megan Thee Stallion speaks about her own encounter with violence. For the record, this is a successful Black woman with a net worth of $3 million. After a party, a man with whom she was not in a relationship shot her twice as she walked away from him. She writes, and I quote, "My initial silence about what happened was out of fear for myself and my friends. Even as a victim, I have been met with skepticism and judgment. The way people have publicly questioned and debated whether I played a role in my own violent assault proves that my fears about discussing what happened were unfortunately warranted. After a lot of self-reflection on that incident, I realized that violence against women is not always connected to being in a relationship. Instead, it happens because too many men treat all women as objects, which helps them to justify inflicting abuse against us when we choose to exercise our own free will. This needs to stop. We all need to create a place in which, not a place, a space in which Black women, bodies of women, but especially Black women's bodies, earn their rightful place. So that in the American context, so that one nation, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all, is not just poetry. Thank you.
Andia, that was amazing. So I am very glad to be here tonight. I am, as some of you know, an agricultural historian, which means literally my research is often in the dirt, which is part of the reason that I am sort of wrapping this up at the end, because I tend to look at things very sort of close to the ground. And one of the things that shows up in my research is the way that work is gendered within those continuities of violence that is itself a form of violence, but then also serves to perpetuate other forms of violence. This warps into a sort of very common form of victim blaming that we're all quite familiar with, where the question then becomes, well, why didn't she, right? Why didn't she leave? Why didn't she take her children? Why did she subject them to? That is almost always the question that gets raised to women in abusive relationships or women whose children are subject to abuse. And behind those questions is very rarely the recognition of the fact that that abuse within the structures of violence that this particular woman is inhabiting might actually be the best choice. That's a painful reality for families where women find themselves trapped within these sort of deliberately created structures of economic violence, because you're making the decision as to whether or not you're willing to subject your children to starvation or physical violence. Are you willing to subject your children to homelessness or the possibility of lack of safety in their home? I look at rural women, and the area that dominates my research is in Western North Carolina, which is a sort of othered agricultural place. You can't grow cotton in the mountains of Western North Carolina, which means there were mixed use agricultural practices surviving for a very long time. And although a narrative of universal whiteness gets artificially created in the late 19th and early 20th century, land in those marginal places was actually one of the few places where African-American families could buy in, could actually afford to purchase a place they could call their own. But they were still trapped in the same sort of cycles of economic production. Tobacco and cotton are the predominant agricultural crops. And weirdly, the same way that we gender everything else on the planet, we gender crops. And tobacco and cotton are male crops. Poultry, dairy, and kitchen gardens are female crops. And they always resided in the realm of female production. When I say the realm of female production, I don't just mean that that's the woman's task. I also mean it's her market route. So for disadvantaged rural women, eggs, poultry, surplus kitchen gardens, and butter become often not just a means of production, but access to the only cash that she fully controls. Poultry is ubiquitous, partially because it's not hard to raise poultry. Anybody who's been around chickens knows they'll eat anything. It's really quite disgusting, but that also makes it possible to raise them in a yard with very little input. And because of that, women were able to grow their own flocks, to cull their own birds, ones that produced the best with very little cash. But between 1920 and 1950, agriculture spirals into a depression. The Great Depression starts in farms before it starts anywhere else. Agriculture enters a deep recession in 1921. Cotton returns 5 cents on the pound. And for most rural farm families, the only reliable, stable income that is coming into those houses comes from dairy, poultry, and later farm gardens, all of which are female mechanisms of production. In the 1920s and 1930s, you see official governmental programs aiming to seize those mechanisms of production from rural women. By the 1940s, with government funding and the increased demand coming out of World War II, they succeed. And by the time you get on the other side of World War II, those farmhouse flocks or home gardens have been converted into poultrymen. Women are still assigned the drudgery, the work that's performed at the house, the work that happens actually in the rural site. That's still women's labor. Mediating that produce on the market, getting the check that comes back in from those eggs or poultry or dairy, that now goes to the poultry man. Women fought for 3 decades to hold on to that market route. But ultimately, part of the sort of mythological power of egg money is that long before it became a male mechanism of production, it was what kept farms alive. The systems of exploitation farming that entrapped all small farmers in the late 19th, early 20th century meant often that egg money was the only thing families had to pay their taxes. And because women's primary job is to care for those outside of themselves, that money was put to that use. But it was put to that use at their will and at their accounting. And women often held back some part. By 1950, you can't do that. And so on the other side of World War II, we see not just a reorganization of local labor, the labor that occurs in the house, but the racialization and gendering of labor that occurs in larger agricultural production. White women can work in canneries. In the county that I look at most closely, a cannery that opened during World War I had 76 white female workers and 14 male supervisors. Black women can work in poultry processing. That's a job that's deemed too dangerous and too dirty for white women. And as we move into the 1950s and the 1960s, those patterns get writ so deeply that women have not just, it's not just that they've lost an independent means of production, it's that they've now become trapped in this wage cycle that Andia referenced at the beginning of her talk. How do you get to the point where Black women earn 67 cents on the dollar today? You designate the worst, most dangerous, most unpleasant, least controlled work as both racialized and gendered. For farm women who had previously had an out, by the time we get to the mid-20th century, they're not just trapped in those economic systems, but being trapped in those economic systems reduces the number of choices they can make about where their lives could be subject to the least violence. Poverty keeps women in positions that subject them to what we all recognize as violence. So at some level, I think we have to recognize that economic violence is on that same continuum, as important as the direct physical violence that women have to mediate when they're trapped within these structures of exploitation. That's all I have to say about chickens, y'all. So
Thank you so much, Jema, and everybody. I just am looking at the time here, and I want to just remind everybody in the audience, if you have some questions, please put them in, and in just a few minutes, we'll turn to your questions. But I have a few of my own. I have to admit, as soon as Michelle started talking, I got out my notepad and started taking notes, just like I was right back in college. So, and I hope this isn't too much of an abrupt change from what everybody's research was, but I wanted to, I guess, address the sort of current moment we're in. And maybe this question is a little bit from a personal point of view, but I guess I find our country to be sort of utterly paralyzed by the issue of abortion rights. I feel like, we have this way of looking at rights, in terms of property, that like we're outraged when property is damaged, or we we continue with largely unrestricted gun rights for the protection of self and property. Or another example, I've heard some people who do not feel like wearing their mask, take on the "my body, my right," the feminist cry, in order to say that it's their right to decide whether or not they wear their mask. But yet, like, the woman's body is not owned, so to speak, by her when it comes to our idea of abortion rights. And so I'm thinking about, this, of course, we mentioned the Kavanaugh and now Barrett. And I was wondering, James, I remember as part of our conversations, if you could briefly recall for everyone the conservative role in passing Roe versus Wade, and perhaps elaborate on why this position has changed, or why is it so hard to secure lasting rights for women, or anybody, it doesn't have to be James, but I did remember you talking about that in our conversation and thought it was pretty interesting and wanting to share it with our audience.
This is actually, it's sort of part of an exercise that I do with my classes. So one of the things I think that we lose sight of is that prior to Roe versus Wade, there was a fairly universal consensus that reform of abortion law was absolutely critical. And so one of the things that I ask my students to do is look at a number of faith statements from organized religious groups advocating for liberalization of abortion laws in the United States. I actually, let me see if I can find it really quickly. Usually they're not so surprised by some, but they're usually quite surprised to learn that the Southern Baptist Convention advocated for the liberalization of abortion laws to support the mental and physical health of the woman, which, given the sort of current argument around abortion rights, seems somewhat shocking to people. And I had the opportunity to hear Sarah Weddington, who as a young lawyer argued Roe versus Wade before the Supreme Court. And she argues that it was the ubiquity of female suffering prior to Roe versus Wade that meant there was this consensus around liberalizing abortion laws. Because so many people knew someone who had suffered the health effects of a backroom abortion or an unsafe procedure. And although it wasn't talked about because it wasn't acceptable to talk about, there were closed hospital wards around the country that doctors and nurses had to rotate through as part of their training to treat the women who were suffering from blood poisoning. And so the effect of that on women actually sort of paying the price of that law with their body was so widely known, if not discussed, that people recognized that they were literally sacrificing women's lives. She argues that the pushback against Roe versus Wade wasn't possible without Roe versus Wade, that you needed the safety of medically safe abortions in order to allow people to create this narrative in which the fetus's rights outweigh the life of a woman. Because when people actually had to look the sort of bloody reality of that in the face, you got these sort of statements of faith that acknowledged health and welfare.
Thanks. Thank you. Does anybody else on the panel want to make any other further comments before we turn it over to audience questions?
I want to, and I am no historian, and this is outside my area of expertise, and with all those disclaimers said, I think it's important to understand the abortion debate in context, and most people don't recognize that abortion was legal in the United States until 1873-ish. Terrible with dates, not a historian. Okay, but the part of the reason that it became illegal is because the medical profession, much like Jama has said with agriculture, the medical profession was looking to take over childbirth. In other words, the male medical profession wanted to oust midwives. And one way to do that was to get in on the childbirth action because there was a lot of it. And they played into racial fears about white women not having enough children and having abortions. So it didn't become illegal until that point. And the reason that I bring that up is I think that some of the pushback to it now is it's a cheap political issue that the politicians, particularly male politicians, can get people to lobby around that doesn't cost them anything, literally no money. I mean, if you want to use education as a platform, you have to pay for it. I mean, I think in some ways, and I do not mean to detract from anyone's faith statements or anything like that, and I'm certainly not doing that. What I'm suggesting is that the reemergence of abortion as an issue has political ramifications and it has gendered power ramifications. It's no mistake that the pushback against abortion happens at the same time we see the backlash against feminism that emerges, at least from a sociological perspective in mind.
I would add to that. I agree with everything that you just said, and I would add to that it's sort of wrapped up in the gay rights movement as well. These become sort of co-entangled issues.
Thanks so much. And Heather, I see you've rejoined us. So I'll turn it over to you. I can't see the audience questions. Thanks everybody who did contribute a question. And Heather, back to you.
Okay, well, I'll start first with a question that was put in the chat box. And that question is, well, it starts with a statement, but this question can apply to a lot of things, but I'm curious, why do you all think Americans care so much about abortion being an option for women?
Can I ask Tawana to clarify which side she means being an option? I'm afraid we might actually be answering the opposite side of her query, but I'm not sure.
I can also unmute Tawana, if you would like, if you're okay with me unmuting you, I can do that as soon as I find you on the list here. Okay, me.
Thank God. I feel like I'm in jail. I'm talking about like just in reference, like why do you guys think Americans are so opinionated to the point to where like they want to switch the decision from like years ago? Like what is the drive in that? Because at the end of the day, I think like it's a personal decision. Like we all have different personal beliefs, but why do our personal beliefs on that specific topic is so strong, like to the point to where we need to like flip this script possibly, like to where we're retalking something which is mind-blowing. I'm just curious, like, you know, what do you guys think about that?
I'll fill the space while other folks are thinking. Tawana, I'm not sure I can actually answer your question. I wrestle with this and have lots of deep history of conflict with people I care about over this issue. And so this is an issue that I don't talk about often in my class or often with the people around me until I'm very clear on where they stand on it. And sometimes that happens accidentally because we're so passionate about it. I think it is absolutely no accident that each side has created a narrative that is difficult to argue against. Because if I hold in front of you a chocolate chip cookie or a Rice Krispie treat, because clearly that's what's happening next in my world. When this is done, I'm going to celebrate. And say, are you pro-choice? Like, make a choice, right? Do you want the cookie? Do you want the Rice Krispie treat? This is your right. You get to make this choice. Like, nobody's going to say, no, I don't like having choices. At the same time, nobody's going to hand you a gun and invite you to kill one of two people, or a person or not a person, and then ask you whether or not you think life is important. Like, well, of course I'm pro-life. I'm not killing somebody, right? I don't want this responsibility. I don't want this job. And it is a job. It's a job in various forms. It's a job to take a life. It's a job. Somebody is actively doing that. Not in every state, not at all the time. But it's there's no surprise here that these two narratives are not talking at each other. Right? To be pro-life is a totally different conversation than to be pro-choice. And yet when you put those two words together in the same room, we're having a very particular conversation, and we are, to our core, already offended by whatever's going on the other side. Doesn't matter which side you're on. And many of you, even though I'm loath to talk about such things, know my politics on it. I won't go further down that road, but it's complicated, and it's deeply and in some ways violently personal. And what's problematic is that it becomes that way, even though many of us who feel that way, and actually now I'm speaking on behalf of other people here, are violently offended by the conversation of life or choice in ways that are 12 steps removed from anybody who's personally been through it. And that is what is so terribly complex and problematic for me, is that people making these decisions are the ones, perhaps, I don't have statistics, perhaps the least likely, particularly if they're men, but even women, perhaps the least likely to have need of these kinds of services, to seek them out, to be in the kinds of poverty, the lack of education, the lack of life choices and opportunities in which so many women who are trying to avail themselves of such services find themselves in need. And so it's the offense. It's not the violence of the act itself or the situation in which a woman finds herself and deems this choice necessary. It's the offense of it. And so we have this conversation in ways where we don't actually talk to each other to avoid that kind of offense. I do not think I've answered your question, but I did manage to spin my wheels for a few minutes. So there you go.
I'd like to add something. I'm not going to answer your question, Tawana, but I am going to give you more food for thought, maybe, or I'm going to muddy the water just a little bit. I am not a sociologist. I'm not an anthropologist. I'm not a historian. I am a professor of literature, and I've been trained to read text, and text can be anything. A text that I see is right across our campus, especially on Saturday. On Saturdays, I see sometimes busloads of white men, for the most part, with white women and white children with all sorts of graphic, gory signs of fetuses and different, like, you know, they strategically want to appeal to a sensible chord in you, right? What I see, what that communicates to me as a woman who has full authority and full control over my body, as a Black woman who has full control over my body, I'm having these people who are privileged to come. I can't even clean my house. When I come here Saturday morning, it's to work. I don't have time to spend 2, 3, 4 hours to come in front of a clinic to protest the choice that women make over their own bodies, regardless of their situations. I talked about rape in my talk. I know of somebody who was raped and has had to have an abortion. That person is me. So when you and your family and your little young children are there with your sign telling me what I can and cannot do with my body, whereas I have a Black husband, 2 Black young boys, and I don't see any of these people arguing and calling out for their safety and their well-being while they are standing or circulating in the streets of America. So for me, there is a careful construct of what life is. There is a careful construction of what kind of life matters. And it troubles me. It makes me so angry every time, all the time. So Tawana, I did say I was not going to answer your question. I was going to give you even more food for thought and trouble the waters even more. But that is my perspective on abortion.
I want to step in here, and I don't know that I know the answer to your question, Tawana, or that indeed anyone has a precise answer to your question that's definitive. But I want to preface what I'm going to pose as a potential answer, at least something for you to think about in this way. If we were entirely concerned with the lives of children in the richest nation in the world, we wouldn't have the poverty rates that we have. There wouldn't be starving children. We wouldn't have the rate of abuse of children. We would have better education for children, pay our teachers. I could keep going. I'm going to stop there. We'd care about kids when they were alive if we were really deeply interested in the lives of children. Indeed, people. So you ask, why does everyone, pardon me to put it this way, but this is what you mean, why does everyone give such a shit about abortion? That's what you're really asking. And in many ways, abortion is a particularly useful issue that centers on women's bodies and the control of them, hearkening back historically to women as property, as Andrea mentions in her talk about women being used to produce, as I mentioned about fears about white women not having enough kids, etc. It is politically expedient because you can as a side, you can appeal to someone's morality, as Mandy pointed out. No matter which side you're on, you can appear moral, right? So this is a fight over whose morality is going to win. And it's a way for, the reason that so many people get invested in it, it's a way for women who are very conservative, etc., mothers who believe women shouldn't work or should work tangentially or whatever they believe, to invest morally in their identities as people, to pick sides, to invest in their faith, even though their faith requires them to do a lot of other things too that they're not as worried about. The other side, or there are multiple sides, we're talking about this black and white, there's multiple sides, so I don't mean to oversimplify. But for other folks, freedoms, liberties, individual decision-making in your private lives are hallmarks of democracy and granted by the Constitution. And so they get all fired up about it because they can take a moral position. I think ultimately what we discover is that the emotional roots of the abortion debate are rooted in people's ideologies, and those ideologies are tremendously gendered. And they're cultivated to create dichotomies that Mandy pointed out, and cultivated to continue with the possibility of gender inequality. All right, I'm shutting up now.
This is very quick, but the one thing that I just want to say is medically safe abortions have always and will always be available to the wealthy. For some people, the stakes in staking a claim here are much lower.
Thank you guys so much for the input. I know it was a really open-ended question. I wasn't looking for a direct answer. I just wanted to see what your thoughts were.
Thank you, Tawana. Okay, I'm going to move on to another question in the Q&A window. This is from Arnisha Sanders. I hope I pronounced that correctly. Society's view of women are too weak to lead while men are committing an overwhelming majority of violence is insane. Then men are proven to be more violent. Black women are perceived as violent. Violence equals strength unless it's seen from a Black woman. Do we ever see that changing?
Could you repeat that?
Sure. Society's view of women are too weak to lead while men are committing an overwhelming majority of violence is insane. Then men are proven to be more violent. Black women are perceived as violent. Violence equals strength unless it's seen from a Black woman, or violence equals strength unless it is seen from a Black woman. Do we ever see this changing?
You guys have a go at it. I'll come from behind. Or if not, I mean, go ahead. I'm sure Michelle has something to say, or Jima, or Mandy.
Yes, things can change. We just have to make them change. In other words, social change is slow and it goes back and forth. But look at your screen. I mean, essentially, women getting PhDs and teaching at universities is a relatively recent thing. For the first time in the United States history, women are more educated than men. This happened in your lifetimes. I don't know what will happen with this, but we did get same-sex marriage through, and I hope it's not a woman who undoes it. Sorry, pissed off about that. Okay, anyway, yeah, I see things changing. How fast it changes, when it changes, depends on, strangely, how we decide, I think, to struggle for scarce resources in society. In other words, violence and control of societies are generally for a struggle for scarce resources of power and wealth. When will that change? Perhaps when we redistribute that better. Very shaky answer on that with forgetting where you.
So I'm a social and cultural historian, and I think that we created most everything because we made it up and then decided to enact it. And I think if we built it, we can unbuild it. Now, none of that's easy.
Yeah, I mean, yay, Michelle, yay, Jima, for being so optimistic. Okay, I am optimistic too. But here's the thing. I don't know who asked the question, but otherwise I would have addressed you by name. But there is a slight problem, right? When we live in a society in which certain bodies are the word is coming to me in French. There's an expression in French that says jouir d'un privilège. It means like they are afforded some, okay, let me put it that way. Let me put it much more bluntly. You have a president right now, a current president who is othering a very successful Black woman. I am in awe of Kamala Harris. I think she's amazing. Every time he opens his mouth, her first name, he is going to go Kamala, Kamala. He is going to play an accordion with her name, othering her, reducing her to a caricature, make a caricature of her. I'm probably mispronouncing that word. while Ivanka, blonde, Barbie looking Ivanka, who has no sort of qualification to be in the White House, is put on a pedestal. So what's going on here? What's going on here is the fact that certain bodies of women have privilege. They are afforded protection and credibility, in that women of color, they do not. And yes, things are going to change. Yes, things have to change. They are going to change. But I'm going to be honest with you. I voted for Barack Obama. Anybody who knows me, they know I'm in love with Barack Obama. I'm in love with Michelle Welcome here, but I'm also in love with Barack Obama. Anybody who knows me, they know that. I never thought after Barack Obama, we would have Donald Trump. Never thought. That's why I have been so steadfast in telling students that they need to vote. They need to be politically engaged. You cannot say your vote does not matter and expect for Black women to have their rightful place in society. And it also is happening here at Centenary. They hired me I am the only Black woman professor here at Centenary. So people who are coming, they see a Black woman as a professor. They see other women who are professors. Look at this panel of women, bright, beautiful women. So this is how it changes. By pulling bodies literally from the periphery and have them occupy the center. That's how we do it, but we need to be intentional about it. It's not going to happen just like that by wishful thinking. And so that's why when Michelle and Gemma said they were optimistic, yes, it is, but there's action that goes along with that.
I would add to how important, oh, sorry, Heather, you were ready to move on.
No, did you answer?
I was just thinking as Andrea was talking, how important role models are. When I was growing up, good grief, could any woman have been cooler than Claire Huxtable? Like, she was in charge of that household. She had her shit together. She was intelligent. She was beautiful. She carried herself with grace and dignity. She encouraged kindness. She, like, all the things I wanted to be, right? Now, the whole Bill Cosby thing, like, deeply complicates all of my memory and warmth about that. It doesn't erase it, it complicates it, which is separate from the, like, women's bodies and abuse and all of those things. When I watch TV with my kids, the real rainbow and variety of not just the faces on the screen, but the types of language, I mean, even across the board of speaking English, the different dialects, the different representations of the way that we use the English language, the different ways in which we use language around sex and gender. My daughter recently, it's been a year now, told Derek and I that she's bi. She's 11. So what it means to be sexual in any way is a little curious to me right now, but she has this sweet relationship with another girl in her grade. And I didn't know that was an option when I was 11. That was nowhere in my universe. That was no, and I know this veers, sort of sidesteps from the conversation about Black women and power. But I think the fact that my children have so much more access to a fuller range of healthy lives, healthy choices, healthy representations about diversity and variety and the value, right, across the board of human lives is, and perhaps you don't see it, perhaps our students don't see it, can't, I think, and forgive me for the privilege of being able to say that, can't see that change the way we can because we have an additional 20 years on you or whatever. There has been such a great change in the kinds of examples that are available to you and then to the generation coming up underneath you. That change is happening. It's frustrating in the moment that you're stuck in because it seems like, and it seems this way to me too, it seems like we're moving backwards. I have felt that. Perhaps I'll own that as my own. Perhaps I'm the only one who's feeling that, but it has felt like we moved backwards from this moment with Barack Obama and this moment in 2018. That's not how math works. 2016, when I stood in a voting booth next to my daughter and voted for a female president. And the 4 years that have followed have been backwards from that in my mind. But this is a small glimpse. This 4 years is a small glimpse in a much longer story and a much prettier and kinder and in some really interesting ways gendered and powerful arc of lived experience. These things take time, but they're coming.
So it feels like there, I mean, we could just keep talking forever. I have one specific question for from Mars Ramsey from Dr. AB, but then there's also a request by Ashley to be unmuted to kind of bring something up. But I know we're running close on time. I just wanted to check in with everybody before moving on to that. And while you guys let me know what you want to do, I'm going to go ahead and hold this up for any students watching. Do you want one more question and then open it up, and people who want to stay on can have a little bit longer? Do you want to go to 7:30?
Yeah, we can.
Okay. So Dr. AB from Mars Ramsey, this specific question. Several academics discuss how Blackness was designed to be an approximation to whiteness, therefore rendering whiteness as an infinite line Black people will never reach. What are your thoughts on this, and how do you think this intersects with colorism in the Black community, especially considering the lighter skinned Black people, especially women, we see idolized in American media?
Oh my God. Marisa, I don't have time for this because that's a can of worms that you just opened. Very briefly, let me start with the Code Noir. The Code Noir was instituted in the 16th century, 16th, 17th century by a French king, which literally took Black color on a spectrum, defining very scientifically every drop of white blood into Black blood a name. I'm not a scientist, but in my mind, what I realize, it's sort of like the white blood is pure, and the Black blood, once the white blood comes into contact with the Black blood, then it's no longer pure, it's contaminated. So you have that contamination happening with the mixing of white and Black, right? To take this further, you have during colonial era in the plantation. Earlier in my talk, I was talking about agency. One of the ways that women used agency while they were enslaved was to, they used their sexuality, right? Because the closer they were to the white master, they could tell themselves that maybe I would get a better treatment. And as the seed of the master begin to disseminate, you would see like lighter and lighter children, right? They were also working in the fields. Some of the lighter women or the lighter children, there begins this hierarchy, right? Of color. And it's very prevalent in every society that has had a colonial past. Is very present in Haiti, for instance, and I was aware of that from a very, very young age. My mother is light skinned. I would observe when we go to Port-au-Prince, which was the capital, and that's where everything was happening. I would see there can be like a line of people. My mom shows up, she is immediately served. It doesn't matter how many people were in that line. My mom, by virtue of her being a light-skinned woman, by virtue of her speaking French, she went immediately above everybody else. At a very, very young age, I saw that. And I was fascinated by that. And I wanted to hang out with my mom because that means that I didn't have to wait in line, as opposed to my dad, who is dark-skinned, but when he wears a suit, but that's a different story. Okay. This is an issue, and much like abortion and much like the treatment of different bodies, I believe that it is up to us, especially in communities of color, to talk about those things, because we tend to sweep those things under the rug, because we have to come together against the dominant culture that we don't want to expose our dirty laundry. And so we tend to keep those things on the hush hush. So Mars, the only thing I have to say is, yes, this is a grave problem. It needs to be talked about and eventually dismantled. You have, for instance, parents who want, for instance, in my family, I'm not light-skinned by any means comparing to my sister, but my husband is a very dark-skinned African, French African man. And that was a problem because the kids are going to come out dark. And the thing is, we need to make the race lighter. You need to marry somebody who is about your complexion or lighter than you are, so the kids, so you can lighten up the race. We have this issue in the Dominican Republic, and that's why you have Haitians and Dominicans, they don't get along. Dominicans oppress Haitians because Haitian people sort of like remind them of a blackness that they don't want to confront. It's, don't get me started, because we will be here until God comes back, because it's a lot to unwind with that. But yes, it is an issue, and we need to break that cycle.
Okay. It is 7:30 now, and Ashley, I think that if we started another discussion, we'd be on here all night. Is it? But I hate to like cut this off, and I don't know. It's such a dilemma. But you know, to be respectful of the panelists and their time this evening, because everybody has other things to do. Perhaps it's possible that you could email and we could carry on a conversation further in a different format. Does that sound reasonable to everyone still here?
Can I ask, I don't actually know if it's Ashley or Lonnie can one of you just email me your question and I will share it? Is that?
Okay.
Please do that, and then I will spread it around. Is that good?
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you. And thank you everybody who came tonight. Thank you all sitting on the panel tonight. I think this was a really wonderful conversation, and I think we could spend hours and hours continuing to talk. I just want to say again, thank you for everybody for all the work you've done, and everybody for joining us tonight. And I hope that everybody has a lovely rest of your evening.